Thank you very, very much for your very kind words. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming. I was actually expecting a very small audience today due to the festivities and to a variety of events taking place at CEU at this very same time. So thank you very much for coming, and most welcome to all of you. We like this kind of turnout in this seminar, and we hope that this continues. We started like this, and I hope we should also finish like this. Now, as Barnabas has said, this is what I'm going to tell you this afternoon is actually based upon the preface to the English translation of a book of mine on secularism, which appeared in 1992, and which tried to fill in a few gaps. Most of all, the gap between the time of publication, original publication, 1992, and the year of the appearance of the English translation, which was 26 years later. That was, of course, half a lifetime indeed, of accelerated history, so there was really quite a lot to say. Anyway, I will specifically concentrate on matters that concern this particular seminar, questions of disenchantment and re-enchantment, specifically at the turn of this millennium. Now, we have heard many speakers addressing us about various matters arising from announcements of post-secularity, of a post-condition overall, of matters having been left behind, almost of modern history having come to a close, the post indicating what is past, not a horizon of what might be coming, and less so an appreciation of the present moment. The post-secular, whatever it might be, remains undefined, except with reference to the secular, which may be abandoned festively by some, but whose parameters are not in any way breached in the context of what one calls a post-secular. I hope today to pull together some strings that were brought up by previous speakers and to conduct them to a specific direction. I have in mind specifically matters relating to what is often called the return of religion and the anti-secular polemics associated with it. And this is where I position the issues of disenchantment and re-enchantment. This is a specific instance of re-enchantment announcing disenchantment with disenchantment, a statement of disavowal, even of claims that secularism and its disenchantments never occurred. I will refer specifically to issues relating to Islam, both because they are interesting intrinsically, and because for all the mediatic exposure, they are not generally well known or well understood. Now to context. There has indeed been a sense of profound change at the turn of with the turn of the millennium. Many elements perceived already in the book that I've mentioned. A sea change with the end of the Cold War, in which 1989 is an epochal event, associated, among other things, with social crises, evident dramatically in one of its results, namely mass migration, arising from the shedding of a Keynesian consensus which existed earlier, which was designed, in fact, to keep social conflicts within manageable proportions, associated with neoliberal regimes of deregulation, resulting in the rapid recession of state-sponsored systems of solidarity, including cultural deregulation, on the ruins of an older language of development, of change, and of improvement overall. What is not often enough noted is that this process has been global, devastating poorer countries in greater measure than Western Europe. Equally pertinent to my purposes is that there has prevailed, under this global regime, a new language for the expression of social and political matters, which is a language of culturalism. That is to say, assuming that cultures, however defined, are the governing instances in any social formation, and that cultures act as a kind of genetic program for any collectivity that we may wish to think about. And culturalism, of course, is expressed in a variety of ways. It's expressed as ancestralism, it's expressed as nativism, and quite a number of other things which have become very familiar in the last 20 or 30 years. This language of culturalism, I will submit to you, has come to be hegemonic in various fields of public discourse, including the output of non-government organizations, of United Nations organisms, of foundations, and of much academic output. Culture, incidentally, if one were to look at a textbook of sociology published 25 years ago, one would have to look very hard to find an index entry for the word culture. Things have changed very considerably, and I think this is an interesting indicator of how this particular notion has come into the public sphere. Now, I would be proposing that culturalism is what is specified in various languages of identity politics, with various collectivities defined as Christian, Muslim, Aryan, Turkic, or what have you. With Islam, certainly, we generally find a reduction of culture to religion, with religion taken as the ultimate explanatory instance in matters of history, politics, and of society. Before going further, I will remind you that this is by no means new. The anti-secular polemic with which this is associated is one reflex of identity politics. Modern history has seen a pendulum swing of nativist and romantic ideas of society and polity in opposition to ideas of improvement, of revolution, of change, and what have you. Lazzi Kontler talked to us about this last week, the week before last. There are a number of key points here, key words, as a matter of fact. They are actually topoi used in this kind of argumentation. Affirmative commonplaces and sentiments. They are generally metaphors indicating vitalism. That is to say, the comparison of human collectivities to somatic composites, to bodies that grow and decline and are diseased and become cancerous and become healthy, and so on and so forth. The use of biological metaphors is really ubiquitous. We found a notion of organism, that is to say, every collectivity is modeled on organic composites, and this is generally designated with the pathetic term, that is to say, the term of pathos, wholeness, and then, of course, historism, which is generally designated or referred to in terms of depth. So in order to take collectivities as whole and as deep, one resorts, on the one hand, to using metaphors of the organism in describing social formations, and secondly, to historism, that is to say, the assumption that change over time is not substantive in any social formation. Now, correlatively with these, we have denial. The denial of consequential change, this is correlated with historism, the denial of internal complexity, which is correlated with organicism. And the contexts, of course, are plural, have many names. Anti-Enlightenment, counter-revolutionary, anti-modernist, anti-rationalist, relativist, and so forth. And as Kant said of Herder, very delicately, that he had spun a fabric of bold metaphors, poetic images, and mythological allusions that serve to obscure rather than clarify, wondering whether, and this is a direct quote, the poetic spirit which enlivens the author's, that is to say, Herder's expression, has not also at times done violence to his philosophy, whether synonyms on occasion act as substitutes for explanations and allegories for truths. Now, I am suggesting that much the same can be said today of the keywords that bear the topoi and sentiments of disenchantment, post-secularity, and so on, that they are primarily rhetorical, bearers of rhetorical pathos, pleasing emotionally to some, but yielding little cognitive outcome. There are a number of phases to this pendulum swing that I mentioned. The first, of course, crystallized with the collapse of the old order in 1789, and I can mention a number of leading lights. Herder, de Maistre, and quite a number of others. Both have been mentioned by Lazzi, who strangely left out Edmund Burke, who, in my opinion, is an extremely important indicator of that spirit. The second followed the eruption of the people, 1830, 1848, boosted by 1870. Leading lights, Carlyle, Gustave Le Bon, Pope Pius IX's syllabus of errors, and so on and so forth. Such moods continued in various forms into the cultural despair and malaise, much of it very morbid, of the fin de siècle. A combination of fear of and disgust and fascination with the common run of humanity on the part of all but the left of the intelligentsia. This was consolidated in the third phase following 1917 and 1918, crystallizing in various forms of fascism broadly defined. Some leading lights, Action Française, Oswald Spengler, Carl Schmitt, Martin Heidegger, Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Society of Muslim Brothers, Madhav Golwalkar, the founder of the Indian Hindu nationalist RSS, or one of its intellectual lights. The fourth, that of 1989, built upon the mobilization of religion during the Cold War and followed upon the consequences and exemplarity of the Iranian Revolution of 1978. It also built upon right-wing liberalism, nurtured by anti-communism. Isaiah Berlin has already been discussed in this seminar, with triumphalist declamations, however short-lived, of the end of history. Also by revisionist historiographies, starting with Horkheimer, Adorno on the Enlightenment, going through to revisions of the French and Russian revolutions as calamities from the 1960s, 70s onwards. There is an ideological continuum that traverses all these currents, continuing through the interwar period in movements with fascism in a variety of its forms, the Muslim Brothers, as I've mentioned, the Indian RSS, and militant strands of romantic Arab, Turkish, and Iranian nationalism. Now to the matter at hand. Anti-secular discourses that arose towards the end of the millennium make two types of arguments: sociological, empirical on the one hand, and ideological on the other. The latter, that is to say the ideological, are informed by a notion of destiny. Not always declared, although, for instance, Fidesz here speaks of destiny, the inevitable destiny of particular human collectivities defined organismically by timeless constituents called cultures, civilizations, religions, traditions, values, and so forth. My contention is that the empirical and sociological arguments against secularism are selectively used to feed the latter, that is to say, the ideological. I will be mentioning three authors specifically: a sociologist, José Casanova, a philosopher, Charles Taylor, and a former anthropologist, Talal Asad. Now, interestingly, Casanova is the most accomplished empirically and analytically, and is excellent witness to the diversion of sociological knowledge into ideological vessels. But first, briefly, to empirical work. The two components of the secularization thesis, a thesis that applies globally, which is associated with modernity, however conveyed and however uneven, and I will use Trotsky's expression, a movement of combined and uneven development. So, among other things, this is defined, that is to say, modernity is defined by a particular form of state organization, by particular bodies of political vocabulary, by particular discursive and cultural forms, including the novel, by state interventionism in the areas of culture and of legislation, by a particular type of intelligentsia, and by what we might define, very generally speaking, as a bourgeois culture. The two components of the secularization thesis related to this are, one, that of differentiation, that is to say, of functional differentiation. Functional differentiation in the context of a developing and growing and consolidating system of modernity. The second is disenchantment. That is to say, the rise and development of particular kinds of cognitive regimes, particular conceptions of society and polity. Now, those of you who might tell you that teleology, that is to say, the inevitability of godlessness and the shedding of religion, is written into the secularization thesis, are not actually looking at the secularization thesis. This arises from certain pious hopes by many secularists, but it is not functionally or structurally inherent in the secularization thesis, except if we take it in very restricted senses, such as, let us say, the positivist eschatology, as it were, of Auguste Comte. But otherwise, it is not structurally or conceptually necessary for the secularization thesis. As for the empirical evidence which comes up, usually what comes up are rates of religious observance, particularly in the United States, and of course, in more recent times, among Muslims. But the rates of religious observance do neither sustain nor disprove the secularization thesis, because the secularization thesis rests upon particular forms of differentiation and complexity in social formations, which neither confirm or which neither entail nor deny continuing religiosity among certain portions of the population in any given place. Secondly, fundamentalism and the return of the religious, as it were, is explainable largely in terms of the social differentiation of modernity, in that when the religious instance is defined as such and as a freestanding instance or a field of social action in society, then it can consolidate itself, and this is my own interpretation of fundamentalism, it consolidates itself into the image of an alternative social form, of an alternative destiny for a particular society. So the incursion of new forms of religion or revived forms of religion into public spheres is itself explainable in terms of social differentiation. Now, this being the case, the only explanation for the twisting of evidence is ideological convenience, one consonant with the culturalist ideological signature of the turn of the millennium, which is an international ideological koine. Here we have a conjunction of secularism, that is to say, of histories of secularism with historism, and this is what I call the sociological redaction of destiny. Applied to societies which happen to have Muslim majorities, the redaction of destiny presumes that, being congenitally predisposed to forces of ethnological density, to what is generally known as Islamic culture or Islamic civilization, these societies must be captive to a cultural incapacity for any change of real consequence. The same, incidentally, has been claimed for Judaism by a number of authors. The changes undergone by these societies over more than a century had been allopathic, if you like, rather than homeopathic, and in the final analysis, a charade. Durable change must be captive to the parameters of origins, of the initial condition defined as religion. We have here a notion of culture as a prison of social instinct, rather than as a field of human action, including improvement. Culturalism, in this sense, is the precise analog to earlier notions of race, which is no longer presentable. Islamist vitalism and nativism, as in fundamentalist action, appears self-evident in a global setting where identity is taken for common sense. Now, my contention is that civilizations, religions, cultures, and nations are in reality not tribes, not the analogues of tribes or small-scale communities, but hyper-social systems of social systems. There's a wonderfully suggestive turn of phrase by Marcel Mauss, speaking of civilizations, as hyper-social systems of social systems. But in the redactions, in the social redactions of destiny, they work as rhetorical figures of continuity, these civilizations and cultures and so on. Now, when considered vitalistically, the secularization thesis is affirmed in historist terms as post-Christian, a sort of Christianity in sheep's clothing, if you like, and denied in non-European settings, at best relegated to one among many multiple secularities. In speaking of secularism and modernity, this perspective yields pluralization. If underdeveloped countries, including those identified as Islamic, cannot really be said to have modernized or secularized, except inadequately or bizarrely, being incapable congenitally of this type of improvement, they can nonetheless be included politely in the conversation and said to have modernized or secularized in their own way. Now, in my view, such multiplications, such attempts to infirm secularization in what one called the longue durée of civilizational history, such thinking in terms of what someone also said was cultural diversity, or to appeal to, again, one other author said, were spiritual ontologies, searching for cultural meanings, claiming thereby to produce what that author called a cultural sociology of secular modernities. Such will have the effect of effacing the concept entirely. They wash over the concept with empirical diversity of the history of secularism, all of which is actual, inflecting the multiplicity of the concept's reference in the direction of historism and romanticism. For quite apart from empirical concerns, it seems incontestable that much of the intent propelling multiplication, that is to say, speaking of multiple secularities, can be understood in terms of a protocol of intercultural courtesy and a token adherence to the celebration of diversity, a manifest case in point for transposing normative interest into cognitive propositions, the ought being transmuted into an is. Now, speaking of multiple secularities, rather than a variety of secularism in the singular, is really mincing words, like saying gosh and golly, right? Concepts and categories, and these include modernity and secularism, are by definition general, pertaining to the whole class of phenomena that they organize. Concepts deployed comparatively cannot be held captive to nominal multiplication, each multiple sui generis, but they rest rather on generic commonalities constitutive of a concept. A concept indicates an analytical grid of variations in which differences and similarities are regarded as variants, not as sui generis individuals. One had better either use the concept in its generality or drop it. Further, being general, concepts are quite naturally applicable outside the immediate circumstances of their elaboration. And this is pertinent to two concepts of relevance to this discussion: secularization and religion. One is surprised that few have had qualms about using, outside of Western Europe, the concepts of the economy and of society, emergent in Western Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, but declare loud reserve when the discussion pertains to secularization or to religion. In the same way, the applicability of the notion of religion to Islam and to Judaism, incidentally, in some instances, is denied on the grounds that the concept emerged in post-Reformation Europe. This is a curious contention, indeed, by one of the heroes of the topic of my talk, Talal Asad, not least that the Islam to which he refers concretely is one which has been reconfigured along models associated with Protestantism, not unlike Reform Judaism, Hinduism, and Buddhism. an objective process, not a fantasy, no matter how traditionalists and neo-traditionalists, post-colonialists and other communalists might wish to have been the case. This is doubly odd as the Quranic text itself has available a very clear and distinct notion of religion that corresponds to the one that Assad attributes to the Reformation. And even more vexing is that Muslim political traditions are full of very distinctive allocations of areas of social reality to the realms of religion and to the realms of the world. Sharia, siyasa, deen, dunya. This is ubiquitous through Muslim traditions for 1500 years. Be that as it may, it is important to note here that secularism is construed as a movement inside religion, rather than what it was historically, part of a broader process of societal differentiation. To note is that the grafting of secularism onto the history of Christianity, much in vogue now, and to which Assad concurs entirely, like the vast majority of Islamist secularism critics, is a variation on an older rhetorical trope of denigration. A trope of denigration of the Enlightenment, later of Marxism, and now of secularism, that they are simply forms of messianism, wolves in sheep's clothing. This is an impressionistic meta-historical statement that is extremely difficult to sustain with historical investigation, not least given the pseudo-historical readings of the relationship between state and church in Europe that underlies extracting secularism from Christianity. It rests on superficial associations, including those between psychological states that characterize revolutions and messianic stirrings. In this historist and vitalist regard, secularization is regarded in rather cavalier manner as a subtraction of religion. Subtraction in these discussions often refers to institutional transformations, but this occurrence is otherwise slight historically. And the argument is anchored more firmly in anti-modern figures of nostalgia and of the sublime, really. The two are brought together by the notion of secularization as a form of loss, of alienation, a usurpation of the authentic, a privation of essence, a state of unwholesomeness, a disnature even. Shakespeare used this wonderful word with reference to Lady Macbeth and to Goneril, the daughter of Lear, with wonderful effect. In counterpart to which affirmation and often enough restoration and resurrection are counterposed. All of these are poetical terms redolent of the occult. At least that is my view. In the final analysis, the specious character of the subtraction model is that it posits a morphological continuity between historical formations and extrudes all consideration of historical breaks that came with modernity. The fact is that the anachronism of the subtraction thesis is based on a prior underlying analytical premise that the relation between secularism and Christianity. These are two volleys in this prior analytical premise, which is conducted in the form of a pseudo-historical narrative, as I had suggested, the one presented by Casanova and Taylor, and the other, for some odd reason called genealogical, by Assad. Taylor asserted that secularization is, and I quote, identified with particular civilizational trajectory, one which he described at very great length with reference to the North Atlantic region, to which he adds psychohistorical factors of the embedding and disembedding of individuals in what amounts to a comprehensive and often despairing attack on modernity as a form, and this is a wonderful term of his, of excarnation. Yet for all the high-grade philosophical skills one would expect from Taylor, discussion of the separate civilization trajectories remain grounded in Christian traditions understood monolithically, and in a view of progress and of the Enlightenment that is really truncated by distaste and distrust. The same sort of conflation arises with Casanova, who claims that secularism is the product of a specifically Western modernity, and that it is therefore, and I quote, fundamentally and inevitably post-Christian. Casanova, who is robustly sociological in outlook, insists that the multiplication of secularism, like that of modernity, should, and I quote, open the possibility that other religions may also play a role in institutionalizing their own patterns of secularization, end of quote, thus locating these processes within religion. Casanova claims further that secularism first arose as a Western theological category. Now, this conveys a close fit with the traditionalist and civilizational culturalist discourse. But its meaning, to me at least, is very uncertain. First of all, I am not aware of secularism as a Christian theological category. It would be helpful if one resisted the very common temptation to dub whatever has a relation to religion as theological. Casanova in particular, who is a former Jesuit, will know this well enough. I am not aware of secularism as a specifically Christian category either, apart from its use by the concept by Christians. Pursuing this line of thinking consistently, one might as well say the economy is a Christian concept, and the Max Planck Institute also, while algebra is a Muslim concept. Well, the common understanding of secularism over the last 2 centuries has acquired a standalone sociological as distinct from an institutional and canon legal profile. What we are left with is a drift that we can see more clearly when we speak of Islam, namely the drift presented as common sense towards identifying past with future and identifying culture, civilization, and religion, and indeed towards rendering religion the defining element of both. In this way, the idea that secularism, which is one outgrowth of social differentiation occurring globally, might have common global characteristics is made to appear as an illusion or a political subterfuge by wily elites. At best, a colonial or elitist imposition or instrument of manipulation and justification. There is, with Casanova, and as a clear consequence of historism rather than of history, a meta-historical assumption of incommensurable historical itineraries, multiple modernities, denominated by him as post-Hindu, post-Confucian, and post-Muslim. Assad complements these arguments with what appears to be appeals to the Solomonic wisdom of native voice. His is an analogy for his is an apology, as a matter of fact, for nativism and relativism, grounded in a rhetoric of attachment, investment, and reverie. His apology for cultural Islamism slides thereby from the sociology of politics to sentimentalist psychopolitics. Assad calls his procedure of understanding Europe's identitarian contrary genealogy rather than history, maintaining that one should break with what he takes to be, and I quote him, coercive constraints of sociological truth. These are, it must be stressed, constraints on self-indulgence and imperatives of cognitive rationality. Genealogy, according to Foucault, who is generally regarded as the alpha and omega of this matter, is a procedure that rejects meta-historical deployment of ideal meanings and teleologies, and is thus opposed to the search for origins. Assad is after origins, that is, the abidance of original conditions. Not unexpectedly, Assad suggests that one should learn to treat the Enlightenment as belonging to what he calls a specific kind of reasoning, and therefore, in the perspective of relativism, not as the ground from which the understanding of other traditions might begin. Much concerned with the operations of power and ideology in anthropology and cultural translation, what he does is appeal to the notion of Verstehen, wielded in such a way as to yield ultimately much sympathy and antipathy, but little analytical understanding. For instance, his disciple, one might say, his ethnographic persona and apostle, the late Sabah Mahmoud's plea that hyper-pietist practices by some Egyptian women should be seen as what she calls technologies of the self. This is entrancing and undoubtedly true in a banal way, but nevertheless structurally, these are technologies of compliant selves, which would in scientific terms qualify as procedures of resocialization by an authority. Resocialization of such wrenching violence as to involve the induction of fear, weeping, and felicity, to which Mahmoud's objects of study truly admit. A perfect fit, hence, between raw empirical data and meta-sociological purpose. This is all culturalist solipsism par excellence. Building upon this position, Assad proposes a nativist rhetoric of attachment. The Islamic religion, he declares solemnly, is a discursive tradition, apparently without roots in a general historical and anthropological category of religion. An anthropology of Islam should begin, he maintains, where Muslims begin, with 1, discursive traditions relating to the Muslim canon, 2, the practice of what he calls apt performance, driven by the canon, what a social psychologist would rather call psychodrama. Islam, which Assad rightly maintains is not a distinctive social structure, is thereby made to escape sociological and anthropological scrutiny. Social structure is irrelevant to the anthropologist working in this register. Islam is thus liberated from the social moorings of its practices and becomes mystified as tradition. Assad's Islam is a mentalist construct with associated performances, albeit shod of its status as an anthropological category. What is it, apart from the impressions one gets in the media, that impels Assad to speak of what he calls strongly held traditions, without indication of who it is who holds to what traditions strongly, and when and under what circumstances? This kind of impressionistic statement is very common in popular journalism, no less than in scholarship. Clearly, what Assad is describing are Muslim beings, actually, who are preeminently and determinately religious. In fact, super Muslims, who do not, in fact, exist. We are back to homeostatic, incommensurable traditions, untranslatable registers, expressing themselves in indigenous voices, which are ultimately affective, aesthetic, and political choices, in effect unrelated and indifferent to cognitive categories. This is illocutionary pathos, not transmissible cognition. Native voice is irreducible and therefore not open to analytical reason, resting upon assertion without recall or recourse. Thus, for instance, Sabah Mahmoud, building upon Assad's skepticism about the notion of religion while studying networks of feminine piety in Egypt, minutely and illuminatingly, with its rituals, reflections, habit formations, and corporeal disciplines, insisted that rather than conceptualize her material and turn her subjects into objects of analysis, as a researcher might, insists that the project should lead to a paracularizing of the researcher's own assumptions. Now, one always welcomes calls for self-reflexivity, but this would need to be a conceptual self-reflexivity rather than an ethical discipline of subjectivity counterposed to cognitive purpose, or a form of contrition, penance, and confession plentifully evident in American anthropology today. I'm almost done. This irrationalist doctrine, attendant upon vitalism, is in this case tailored to an apology for contemporary identitarian Islamism. The solipsism it conveys is not one whose consequences can be taken seriously. For Assad uses the very conception of religion he decries so much to speak of Muslims in Europe, or rather to reconstitute Muslim ethnological material as Muslim, as it were. He advocates a society of Stände, of estates, something on the analogy with a confederation of millets or a confederation of ghettos, without dominance. That is to say, he's proposing a polity without politics. a geographical coexistence of minorities. 4, he maintains Muslim immigrants, and he still calls them immigrants after many generations, cannot be satisfactorily represented in Europe, given Europe's ideological construction, where they cannot be represented as Muslims. That they are represented as citizens, like other citizens, and without special pleading, seems to be entirely unimpressive and uninteresting to him. What Assad takes for Muslim identity, and what Casanova and Taylor take for civilizational paths, are not forces of nature that predestine human collectivities to specific outcomes or to restricted horizons of possibility. Local voice, be it in Riyadh or in London, is not a voice of nature. It is a habitus of affectation and contrivance, elaborated by apt performance, however sincerely performed. In both Jakarta and Cairo, what goes for local Muslim voice is a result of a recent historical development deploying much political and social engineering. After all, when signs and tokens of authenticity are truly authentic, then they are, like folklore, framed as a medley of vestiges with varying degrees of attractiveness and aptness, not as actual practices. Assad never took his own line of thought seriously enough to propose that his own advocacy of tradition might itself be an apt performance of anti-modern ideology. Thank you very much.